The mud came first, then the maps. I didn't expect to find this. I was researching something else entirely. The sudden proliferation of insane asylums in the 1840s. When I kept running into the same word in old municipal records, engineering surveys, and frontier settlement reports. The word was inundation. Not flood, not storm damage. Inundation. A specific, clinical, almost bureaucratic word for something that, when you trace it across 3 continents in 60 years, starts to look less like a natural event and more like a coordinated erasure. This is a story about mud, about what was under it, and about the maps that were drawn immediately after. In 1811, a French cartographer named Jean-Baptiste Correbeuf submitted a survey of the Mississippi Basin to Napoleon's Geographic Commission. The survey noted, with almost casual precision, the existence of 37 settlements between St. Louis and the Gulf of Mexico that did not appear on any prior French colonial map. He described structures, elevated roadways, brick foundations visible above the waterline. He noted, and this is a direct quotation from a partial translation sitting in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, that several of these sites appear ancient beyond the period of known habitation and submerged to a depth inconsistent with seasonal flooding. That report was shelved. The official story goes like this. The Americas, Africa's interior, and vast swaths of Central Asia were, prior to European exploration and settlement, either sparsely inhabited wilderness or home to pre-literate tribal cultures with no permanent urban infrastructure. The great civilizational projects, the cities, the roads, the administrative networks, those belonged to the Old World. Greece, Rome, China, Egypt. The New World was new. That's why they called it that. The maps made after colonization reflect reality. They reflect what was there. Let me be fair to that narrative. There are serious scholars who have spent careers documenting indigenous cultures across these regions. The work is real. The archaeology is real. The oral traditions are real. I am not dismissing any of it. What I am doing is asking a different question. Not what was there, but what happened to what was there just before the maps were redrawn. Because the timing is almost theatrical. Let's start with the numbers. Between 1811 and 1860, the geological record across North America, Northern Africa, and Central Asia documents a phenomenon that researchers today call alluvial surge events. Essentially, massive deposits of silt, clay, and organic debris that settled, in some places, dozens of feet deep, over periods ranging from a single season to several decades. These aren't controversial. They're in the stratigraphy. You can read them like rings in a tree. What is controversial is their scope. A 2003 paper published in Quaternary Science Reviews by geomorphologist Dr. Helmut Bruckner documented alluvial deposits in the Caspian lowlands dated to approximately 1815 to 1835 that covered an estimated 200,000 square kilometers. Not eroded, covered. In some locations, the deposit layer reaches 14 meters deep. 14 meters. That's a 4-story building. Gone. Sealed under mud. Speaking of sealed, there's a document that has bothered me since I first found it. It's a field report from a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers survey team in 1848, now held in Record Group 77 at the National Archives in Washington. The team was tasked with assessing road building viability along the Ohio River Valley. Their report describes, repeatedly, the difficulty of surveying because of what they called recent sedimentation of anomalous character, obscuring prior terrain features. They reference, matter-of-factly, brick and cut-stone foundations visible in eroded riverbanks. They note chimneys, plural, protruding from sediment layers dated, by their own rough calculation based on tree growth above the deposit, to no earlier than 1820. The report recommends further investigation. No follow-up survey was commissioned. Which brings me to the maps themselves. Between 1820 and 1870, the great cartographic institutions of Europe, the British Ordnance Survey, the French Dépôt de la Guerre, the Prussian General Staff Mapping Division, produced more new maps of the world than had been produced in the previous 3 centuries combined. This is not disputed. It's celebrated, actually. The age of modern cartography, scientific mapping, the end of speculation and the beginning of precision. But here's what matters. When you compare the maps made before 1800, the colonial era surveys, the merchant navigation charts, the missionary expedition sketches, with the maps made after 1840, something strange happens. Features disappear. Not coastlines. Not mountain ranges. Those remain. What disappears are the interior annotations. The old maps, messy, imprecise, drawn by people who were there, are full of notations. Ruins observed here. Ancient road, origin unknown. Stone structures, uninhabited. Elevated earthworks, pre-colonial. These annotations appear in Portuguese maps of West Africa from 1680, in Dutch maps of the Mississippi Delta from 1730, in Russian expedition maps of the Kazakh steppe from 1790. By 1860, those annotations are gone. The maps are clean, precise, empty. The official explanation is that early maps were inaccurate and speculative, and later scientific surveys corrected their errors. That's reasonable. That's probably true for many features. But it doesn't explain why multiple independent cartographic traditions, across different languages and imperial interests, all added ruins notations, and then a new generation of maps, also from different traditions, also independent, all removed them. That's not correction. That's consensus. I spent 3 weeks trying to understand the 1816 event. You may know it as the year without a summer. Tartaria erupted in April 1815, sending an estimated 150 cubic kilometers of debris into the atmosphere. Global temperatures dropped. Crops failed. Famine spread across Europe, North America, and Asia. This is the official, well-documented, scientifically verified story. I'm not challenging it. But here's a pattern that the Tartaria narrative doesn't fully account for. The crop failures of 1816 to 1817 are well documented in Western Europe and the northeastern United States. What's less discussed is the infrastructure response, or more precisely, the near-total absence of one in regions that should have had it. If you have a city, a real city, with granaries, with road networks, with administrative capacity, famine is manageable. Terrible, but manageable. History gives us examples. Rome managed famines. China managed famines. Egypt managed famines. You draw down reserves. You redirect supply chains. You survive. What the record shows, in region after region across the 1810s and 1820s, is not famine management. It's famine collapse. Population centers that should have had the organizational depth to respond simply didn't, or couldn't, or weren't there anymore. In the Mississippi Basin, settlements that appear on 1790s French colonial maps are simply absent from American survey records by 1820. Not abandoned, not relocated. Absent. No census notation. No deed transfer. No ruin survey. Just gone from the administrative record entirely. Maybe the French maps were wrong. Maybe those settlements were always marginal and simply weren't worth recording after the Louisiana Purchase. Maybe the American surveyors had different priorities. But here's what I keep returning to. The French maps weren't alone. Spanish missionary records from the same region, dated 1803 to 1808, describe populated towns along river junctions that later American surveys mark as uninhabited wilderness. 2 colonial powers, 2 languages, 2 separate bureaucratic incentive structures. The same towns, then nothing. Let me bring you to Algeria. 1830. France invaded Algeria in June of that year. The official justification involved a debt dispute and a diplomatic insult. The real reasons, as historians acknowledge, were colonial ambition and domestic political pressure on Charles X government. This is not controversial. What is less examined is what French military engineers found when they began the infrastructure work that followed the conquest. Their field reports, held in the Service historique de la Défense archives in Vincennes, partially digitized, describe, with evident bewilderment, the landscape they were attempting to build on. They found roads. Roman roads, yes, some of those. But also roads that the engineers specifically noted were not Roman in construction technique. Different stone, different grade, different width. Roads that appeared to lead to sites that were, by 1830, buried under between 1 and 3 meters of silt and wind-blown debris. They found wells. They found the remains of irrigation channels. They found what one engineer, a Major Lepic, described in an 1832 report as the ghostly outline of a city, visible only when the morning light catches the depressions in the earth at a particular angle. Major Lepik's report recommended systematic excavation of several sites. The recommendation was not acted upon. The sites were built over for French colonial infrastructure within the following decade. The timing is almost theatrical. Here's the part that keeps me up at night. The 1840s and 1850s see an extraordinary global phenomenon: the sudden, aggressive, and remarkably well-funded rise of the archaeological profession. The British Museum begins systematic acquisition of ancient artifacts. Layard excavates Nineveh. Champollion deciphers hieroglyphics. Schliemann will go looking for Troy. Suddenly, the entire Western intellectual establishment is obsessed with the ancient past. Why then? The official answer is the Enlightenment. Scientific progress. Romantic nationalism. All true. All real. But consider the sequencing. First, there is a global sedimentation event, or series of events, that buries significant portions of 3 continents under mud in the first quarter of the 19th century. Then, in the very next generation, there is an explosion of professional interest in recovering the deep past. Not the recent past, not the just buried under mud past. The ancient past. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Troy. The archaeology was real. The discoveries were real. But they were discoveries of a past that was safely remote, safely datable to thousands of years ago, safely separated from whatever was sitting under 14 meters of Central Asian silt or under the orderly street grid of a freshly platted American frontier town. Maybe that's coincidence. Maybe the intellectual currents simply align that way. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But the institutions that funded this archaeology, the Royal Geographic Society, the Smithsonian, founded 1846, the École Française d'Extrême-Orient, were the same institutions producing the new clean maps. The same generation, the same funding networks, the same governments. And not one of them launched a systematic survey of the fresh sedimentation layers. Not one. Which brings me to the trees. Dendrochronology, tree ring dating, is one of the most reliable tools in historical climate science. Trees record stress. Bad years produce narrow rings. Good years produce wide ones. A traumatic event, a flood, a drought, a sudden temperature drop, leaves a signature that can be read centuries later. In 2011, a team from the University of Arizona's Laboratory of Tree Ring Research published an analysis of oak chronologies from across North America and Europe. They documented a remarkable convergence of narrow ring sequences across 1816, 1817, and 1818. That's the Tambora signature. Expected. What's less remarked upon is a secondary narrow ring sequence the study notes, almost in passing, centered on approximately 1843 to 1848. Smaller than the Tambora sequence, but present, consistent, across sites in the American Midwest, Northern Europe, and, in the subset of samples from Central Asia, particularly severe. The 1840s narrow ring event has no agreed-upon volcanic cause. The Smithsonian's Global Volcanism Program lists no eruption of sufficient scale in that period to account for it. So what caused it? The study doesn't speculate. It notes the anomaly and moves on. I found this while researching something else entirely. The pattern, if you choose to see it, goes something like this. In the early 19th century, possibly triggered by Tambora, possibly by something else, possibly by a confluence of factors that our current models don't fully integrate, there were catastrophic inundation events across multiple continents. These events buried existing infrastructure, disrupted existing population centers, and reset the visible landscape to something closer to wilderness than what had existed before. In the aftermath, colonial and imperial governments surveyed these landscapes with fresh eyes, drew fresh maps, and documented what they saw: an apparently empty or sparsely settled terrain waiting to be civilized, developed, and administered. They were not necessarily lying. They may have been describing what was genuinely visible above the mud line. But beneath the mud line, the record suggests, was something more complex. And the professional and institutional infrastructure that emerged in the mid-19th century, the museums, The geographic societies, the archaeological expeditions, directed its attention resolutely toward the ancient and the safely distant, rather than toward the recently buried and the uncomfortably proximate. That's not a conspiracy. Conspiracies require coordination and intent. What I'm describing is something more mundane and more troubling, a structural incentive. New empires need new land. New land needs empty history. Empty history needs clean maps. And clean maps need the mud to stay where it is. Here's what I know. The alluvial deposits are real. The stratigraphy is measurable. The gap between what pre-1800 maps annotated and what post-1840 maps show is documentable. The institutional silence around fresh sedimentation surveys is a matter of archival record, or more precisely, of archival absence. Here's what I don't know. What was under the mud? How it got there? Whether the timing was coincidence or consequence? Whether the map makers knew what they were leaving out, or simply drew what they could see? Here is what remains. In a filing cabinet at the Service historique de la Défense in Vincennes, Major Lepic's 1832 report still exists. The ghost city he described, visible only at a particular angle of morning light, is now under a French-built road that was laid over it in 1854. The road is still there. The ghost is still under it. In Record Group 77 at the National Archives in Washington, the 1848 Army Corps of Engineers report still describes chimneys rising from anomalous sediment. No follow-up was ever commissioned. The Ohio River has shifted its course 3 times since then. Whatever was in those banks is deeper now. The Corriboeuf survey of 1811, the one that noted 37 settlements not on any prior map, was partially translated in 1987 by a graduate student at the Université de Paris. The translation was never published. The graduate student's name was Marguerite Fontenay. I found a reference to her work in a footnote in an unrelated 2001 paper on colonial cartography. I have not been able to locate the translation itself. Maybe it doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it's sitting in a box somewhere, waiting. Maybe the mud keeps its secrets the same way institutions do, not through active suppression, but through patient accumulation, layer over layer over layer, until the depth itself becomes the argument for not digging. I don't have answers, only patterns. And once you see them, you cannot unsee them.